They tell the story now, like a whisper passed through moss and mist, something too quiet for the daylight, but too heavy to ignore once night arrives. The kind of tale a late-night radio host might read when most of the world is asleep, and only the restless remain awake, listening. They say it began on the south edge of a small Louisiana town, once carried by the rhythm of passing trains, somewhere beyond the last working street lamp, where the humidity thickens and the rail ties sink halfway into mud. Two brothers lived there, both African-American, teenagers whose days were filled with school, chores, and afternoons spent tossing pebbles at rotting freight cars. They never thought danger would stroll just beyond their backyard. They never believed that history, like steam pressure, could build up loud enough to drown out even the sound of a passing locomotive, until the disappearances began. Their names were Marcus, 15, tall for his age, with a calmness that often made adults trust him faster than they should, and Elijah, 14, quick-witted, more likely to talk his way out of trouble than avoid it entirely. They lived with their father, James Carter, a quiet man who worked odd shifts at the rail maintenance yard. Their mother had left many years ago, under circumstances they only heard whispers about. If asked directly, their father would divert his gaze, tightening his jaw, saying only that some things aren't meant to be spoken again. He was a man of few words, but those words held weight like loose gravel on the rail lines that you don't notice until it has already slipped under your foot. Marcus respected the silence. Elijah resented it. The town itself didn't have much of a name outside county maps and old shipping routes. Locals just referred to it as the Track Town or Railroad Street, though Railroad Street was only one of several half-forgotten lanes. In the evenings, you could smell the swamp creeping in, hear cicadas buzzing like distant power lines, and feel the kind of heat that made the air feel thick enough to chew. To outsiders, it looked ordinary, but to those who stayed long enough, something felt wrong, as if shadows moved differently here, as if the fog that rolled in every night carried memories along with moisture. No one spoke openly of fear until the first child went missing. His name was Benjamin Rhodes, age 9, last seen cutting through an alley that led toward the tracks. The police combed the area, searching abandoned stations, checking drainage ditches, and following rusted rails to nowhere. Dogs sniffed the overgrowth, church groups prayed, and for a brief time the town held its breath, expecting resolution. But none came. Instead, a second disappearance followed 2 weeks later, then a third. Each time, small feet vanished along the margins of Railroad Street. Each time, the official statement said there were no signs of struggle. Marcus had collected newspaper clippings from his grandfather's attic one Sunday afternoon, while Elijah argued that they shouldn't mess with old skeletons. The articles were yellowed and brittle, from the late 70s and early 80s, reports of prior disappearances. Children gone without trace. Parents blaming the fog, some pointing to superstition. The headlines mentioned an unidentified presence along the rail lines that locals feared to describe. One badly faded clipping referenced a night walker seen between 2 and 3 a.m., long-limbed and silent, drifting like it wasn't walking, but gliding over the gravel. That article stopped mid-sentence. Marcus stared at it for a long time. Their father seemed unsettled the day Marcus brought the clippings downstairs. He didn't yell, but his reaction made them both step back. He carefully gathered the papers, placed them in a battered metal box, and locked it without explanation. Some history, he said, voice low, don't need to be reopened. Folks around here learned once what happens when we poke at things meant to stay buried. When Marcus pressed for answers, James simply walked outside, lighting a cigarette, though he'd quit years before. Elijah rolled his eyes, muttering about secrets that choke families. But that night, neither brother slept easy. Soon afterward, rumors began circulating among the older residents' stories of something seen along the rails after dark. A silhouette against the fog, visible only in the periphery. Some claimed it appeared just before a disappearance. Others insisted it was drawn to regret, that it searched for someone who owed it a debt. Most people dismissed such talk as superstition, but whispers lingered, clinging to town like the dew on rusted tracks. One evening, Elijah said he heard footsteps outside their window around 1 a.m. He described them as slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet along gravel. Marcus didn't want to believe him, but he remembered hearing something too, a rhythmic scraping, faint but distinct. Their father, who normally slept through anything, appeared at their door around the same time. His eyes looked hollow, like he'd heard the sound before. "Stay away from those tracks," he told them, "especially after dark." They nodded, though they didn't fully understand. As tension grew, local authorities escalated patrols. A short special report aired on regional radio, warning miners to avoid unmonitored areas near rail lines during nighttime. Marcus recorded it on his phone, listening to it later. A voice in the background mentioned historical parallels, but that part never made it into the official transcript. Some residents started boarding up windows facing the tracks. Others left town entirely, but most stayed, hoping silence would protect them, as it had generations before. In school, whispers followed the brothers. Some said their father might know more than he revealed. Others claimed the shadow on the tracks was connected to family history. A substitute teacher once paused when marking attendance, eyes briefly settling on Marcus and Elijah before moving on without speaking. They both noticed. Neither commented. As days passed, the humidity thickened. Investigators posted flyers showing the missing faces along telephone poles. The rail line, long unused for freight runs, seemed quieter than ever yet at night. The faint hum of an unseen engine sometimes trembled to the ground. When that happened, Elijah would sit up in bed, staring at the ceiling. Marcus heard it too, like a locomotive passing far in the distance, though no trains had run through the area in years. One Saturday, while exploring the overgrown field behind their house, the brothers found an intact section of rusted track, mostly buried beneath mud and weeds. Along the side, etched into a wooden tie, were marks resembling initials, too worn to decipher. Beside them lay a broken lantern and a patch of scorched earth no wider than a dinner plate. Marcus reached toward it, then hesitated. "Feels like someone tried to mark something here," he murmured. Elijah just shivered, stepping back. That night, they questioned their father gently at dinner. Marcus asked if there had ever been accidents on the tracks. James set his fork down, staring at the empty plate. For a moment, he looked older than his years. "Once," he said, voice nearly a whisper, "there was a choice to make. I made the wrong one." Before either brother could reply, he stood up and left the room. They heard the back door open and close. Elijah pushed his food aside. "He knows something," he whispered. Marcus nodded. They both agreed not to pry further, at least for now. Soon after, a parish newspaper ran a short piece under local features, titled "Unease Along Railroad Street, Then and Now." It referenced 5 disappearances occurring within similar conditions over 4 decades, noting a phenomenon described by certain eyewitnesses as a lone figure moving parallel to the rail lines after midnight. The article mentioned older records destroyed in a warehouse fire, but hinted some documentation might still exist privately. Marcus saved the article, hiding it under his mattress. he didn't show Elijah. The brothers' routines changed. They no longer lingered near the tracks at dusk. Marcus tried to focus on homework. Elijah spent more time drawing dark shapes in his sketchpad. Their father seldom slept, often wandering the yard around 2 a.m., as if keeping watch. The town grew quieter each night, houses dimming their lights earlier. Church bells rang more frequently, calls for prayer unspoken but understood. They say that in towns like ours, memory doesn't just live in the people. It sinks into the rail lines, staining the wood and steel, nesting in the cracks between ties like damp air waiting to rise. And when the past gets heavy enough, it doesn't stay buried. It walks. That summer, after the disappearance of fog as suddenly as it had rolled in, Railroad Street pretended to breathe easier. But you can't fool the land that raised your secrets. You can't unhear the sound of something moving where trains stopped running long ago. Marcus and Elijah sensed it first, not in what was happening, but in what had gone quiet. The brothers noticed their father was changing. James Carter had always been a man folded into himself, keeping his thoughts tucked away like train schedules no longer relevant. But in the weeks following the aborted rail dismantling project, something steeled behind his silence. At dinner, he'd barely touch his food, gaze drifting to the window, overlooking the maintenance yard. Marcus saw him flinch at the distant creak of metal on metal, though no one else seemed to hear it. Elijah sketched in long stretches, drawings of dark silhouettes beside the tracks. One evening, Marcus gently asked what he was drawing. Elijah closed the pad and whispered, "It's the shape I keep seeing at the edge of things." Neither mentioned it again. The dismantling crew returned a week later under clear skies. The morning sun felt hot and unfamiliar, as if nature had blinked awake too brightly. Marcus and Elijah were at school when the machinery began tearing into rotted rail beds. Workers reported unearthing fragments of old lanterns, splintered wood, and rusted tools tied with cloth items carefully buried, not discarded. One worker, a veteran of maintenance jobs, told his supervisor the ground felt warm when he stepped off the track section. Others laughed. That afternoon, James received a call from the yard chief. Witnesses said the color left his face. He didn't speak a word for the rest of the day. At 2 a.m., Marcus woke to the soft creak of floorboards. He followed faint light to the stairs and found his father sitting alone in the kitchen, a single lamp glowing above. James held the locked metal box from the attic, keys shaking in his hand. "I tried to keep this from you," he said without looking up. Elijah joined them silently, leaning against the doorframe. James unlocked the box and placed yellowed papers across the table. They weren't just clippings. There were copies of police reports, handwritten notes, and one old photograph. 3 men stood beside the tracks, one of them unmistakably a younger James Carter. His expression in the photo mirrored the unease he wore now. James began to speak with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed the story in his head, but never dared give it voice. "Back then, I wasn't much older than you are now. Thought I could outrun fear like anyone young and strong enough to believe it. There were disappearances, same as now. Kids gone without sign. Some nights, we'd gather near the rail lines, hoping to catch whoever was behind it." He paused, swallowing hard. "But what we caught didn't walk like a man." He told them about a night when he and 2 friends saw a figure drifting alongside the track, just beyond lantern light. No features, no sound. They thought it was a trick of mist until one friend reached toward it. It didn't turn, didn't react, just kept pacing the rails. James said carefully, "We followed. We shouldn't have." The figure vanished behind an abandoned storage shed. They heard a low, rattling sound like a half-broken whistle, and the younger boy with them collapsed, eyes blank, breathing but unresponsive. He woke the next morning, but never spoke again. His mind just left, James whispered. The memory seemed to hollow him. Marcus leaned forward. Did it take the kids back then? James nodded slowly. It shows times when people forgot what came before. It returns when memory fades. It wants continuation. Something to feed the silence it carries? Elijah shivered. Why didn't you stop it? Their father stared at the papers. We tried. We laid down markers to make a boundary metal, ash, light. For a while, it held. But boundaries don't last when the land gets disturbed. His eyes met theirs, weary but resolute. And now people are tearing up the tracks. Before leaving the table, James handed Marcus a folded paper. On it was a crude map marking a stretch of rail, half a mile west of Railroad Street, an area scheduled for removal the next morning. If they pull that section out, he whispered, it won't have anything keeping it tethered. He reached out, resting a trembling hand over theirs. Do not go near the tracks, he said. But if you hear what I fear we will, know that no one should be out there alone. The next day, the town moved as if nothing lingered beneath the surface. The dismantling proceeded under the supervision of county officials brought in to speed the process. Marcus and Elijah sat through classes in a haze, their father's words echoing between lessons. At lunch, Elijah asked Marcus if they should intervene. Marcus said no, they weren't trained, weren't strong enough. But we can watch, he added. Elijah understood. That afternoon, instead of heading straight home, they diverted toward the ridge overlooking the tracks. From the hilltop, they saw workers carving into the earth. As metal tore from soil, a hush descended over the site. The wind stilled. Birds vanished. A moment later, the ground shuddered lightly, not an earthquake, just a tremor like a train passing somewhere too distant to see. The workers paused, but continued their labor. Marcus glanced at Elijah. It's starting, he said. That evening, their father didn't return home. His truck remained parked near the maintenance yard. Marcus called him twice. No answer. Elijah suggested going to find him. Marcus hesitated, then agreed. By the time they reached the yard, dusk had settled into a dark rust along the horizon. James stood by the fence, staring toward the newly exposed rail area. He turned as they approached, his voice low. You shouldn't be here, Marcus replied carefully. Neither should you. James nodded, but didn't argue. Tonight, he said, the tracks will remember everything. He gestured toward the lowest point of the dismantled section. I made a promise years ago to hold it back. I thought removing the rails would weaken its tether. I was wrong. It strengthens it. Whatever walks comes freer now. Marcus's heart tightened. What happens if it does? James lowered his gaze. Someone will disappear. Or worse, it will be taken without being gone. Elijah looked toward the tracks as fog began creeping inward, swirling low. Dad, he said softly, what does it want? James inhaled slowly. A witness. A keeper of the story. It wants memory to carry it forward. And it chooses those who already listen. He glanced between his sons. I always feared it'd choose you. In the distance, gravel shifted with deliberate rhythm, like footsteps pacing. Marcus felt the air thicken. Elijah stared ahead, eyes widening. Through the fog, a faint outline drifted parallel to the rails, unmoving yet advancing, like space bending around it. No feet touched ground. It moved without sound, except for an occasional scrape when gravel rolled beneath unseen weight. Marcus grabbed Elijah's shoulder. Don't look directly. he whispered. Elijah nodded, fixing his gaze slightly aside. James stepped forward, placing himself between the figure and his sons. You aren't coming through this time, he said under his breath. Whether speaking to an entity or memory, neither boy knew. He pulled a rusted lantern from his coat pocket, the same the brothers had found buried weeks earlier, and struck a flame. The glow flickered weakly, but cast an arc across the fog. For a moment, the figure slowed, its outline shuddering like disturbed mist. The rail beneath it vibrated faintly. They say the final night came with no warning, though that isn't quite true. Warnings had been woven into the land for decades in the silence between father and sons, in the tremor of the rail tracks long. After trains stopped running in the moments, when fog lingered too long around houses that dared face the line. What arrived was not sudden, it was simply inevitable. And when it came, nobody was truly awake, but nobody was entirely asleep either. Everyone knew something was waiting beneath that night. It started earlier than the others. Sunset bled slowly across the sky in streaks of rust red and iron brown, the colors of worn train cars. The air was unnervingly still. The town felt paused, like sound had stepped backward. Marcus and Elijah sat in the living room while their father paced by the window. He hadn't spoken all evening. His eyes remained fixed on the route leading toward the dismantled rail section, as if watching for a train that existed only in memory. The silence between them stretched long, unbroken until Marcus finally said, "It's coming tonight, isn't it?" James didn't turn. "It's already here," he replied. No one dared ask what he meant. The brothers understood without needing explanation. Dinner remained untouched. Lights were dimmed, though not fully extinguished, as if brightness would draw attention. On the coffee table lay the old map James had given Marcus, now marked with fresh notations in red ink coordinates, times, fragments of phrases that looked more like warnings than instructions. "Why show us this if we're not supposed to go?" Elijah asked quietly. Their father answered with a voice worn thin. "Knowing where not to stand is sometimes the only way to stay standing." By 10 p.m., fog began creeping along the ground outside, seeping under gaps in the fence like smoke in reverse. The sound came next the distant creak of a slow-moving freight car, though the yard had long been empty. Marcus leaned closer to the window. Elijah shifted uneasily. "I thought no trains ran here anymore," he whispered. James finally turned to face them. "They don't. That sound isn't a train. It's what's left of one." A low hum followed, faint at first, then growing steadily until it matched the rhythm of a steady heartbeat. The house seemed to resonate with it, walls trembling in subtle waves. Marcus felt it in his bones. Elijah clutched the armrest. Their father stood, jaw clenched. Then he said something neither would forget. "If it tries to speak to you, don't answer. If it tries to show you something, don't look. The only thing that binds it is that it cannot fully cross alone." "What does that mean?" Elijah asked. James hesitated. "It needs someone to witness, someone to carry it forward." He looked at each son in turn. "Tonight, it chooses, and one of you must refuse." The humming deepened, rattling glass panes. Outside, fog thickened around the tracks. The outline of the dismantled rail line shimmered faintly under moonlight. And then, for the first time, the figure did not approach the tracks. It stepped from them. Slowly, deliberately, as if crossing a threshold, long held shut by rusted steel and forgotten light. Elijah gasped. Marcus blinked hard, feeling his father's warning like an anchor. The figure wore no features, yet there was a vague imprint of a face like something once human, now blurred. It drifted forward without touching earth. At the threshold of their yard, it paused, head tilting slightly toward the house. James stepped forward, blocking his sons. "You don't get to choose them," he said quietly. "You chose long before this night." The figure remained still. Then came the sound like a whistle, not of steam, but of air rushing through something hollow. It carried words without language, meaning without shape. Elijah clutched his ears. Marcus staggered, dizzy. James fought to remain steady. "It remembers," James said through clenched teeth. "It remembers the night we tried to bind it. We failed, but we slowed it." He looked toward the fog-covered tracks. "Tonight it resumes the journey we interrupted." The figure lifted an arm, if it was an arm, and pointed toward the house. Then toward the boys. James stepped in front of them, voice shaking yet resolute. "Take me, if that's what you want." The air stilled. The figure paused. Then it shook its head. A sound rose from the rails, like a train approaching from miles away, growing louder by the second. Marcus and Elijah turned toward the window. Fog rippled. The rails glowed faintly, pulsing. Time seemed to slow, and through the haze, the impossible appeared. The shadow of a train, silent and spectral, rolling along the dismantled tracks. It moved without sound, without steam, its cars flickering like images from a memory too old to hold shape. The figure looked back toward the apparition, then toward the boys. Marcus understood. "It's not just taking," he whispered. "It's returning." The spectral train stopped in front of the house. Doors that weren't visible opened. Marcus felt cold air rush inward. Elijah stared, eyes wide. James shouted, "Don't look." But it was too late. Elijah had already seen. He stepped forward unconsciously, drawn like a moth to dimmest fire. Marcus grabbed his arm. Elijah's voice shook. "I see them," he whispered. "The kids. They're in the cars." Marcus tightened his grip. "They're gone." "You're not." But Elijah's eyes filled with tears. "They're asking for help." In that moment, Marcus realized the truth of their father's words. It didn't want someone simply taken. It wanted someone to carry the memory onward, someone who heard, someone who would not let it fade. Someone like Elijah. "No," Marcus said, stepping between his brother and the shifting outline of the train. "Not him." The figure seemed to regard him. The humming intensified. James shouted, "Marcus, stop!" But Marcus didn't listen. He stepped toward the apparition, eyes unfocused. Through flickers of movement, he could almost see faces distorted, sorrowful, waiting. A pressure built behind his eyes. The world blurred. He heard voices, not from outside, but from within. Layered whispers from decades of silence. "Witness," they urged. "Remember." Marcus felt his strength falter. Elijah lunged forward, dragging him backward. "No," he shouted. "You don't get to decide for us." James moved quickly, slamming an iron stake, one of the old boundary markers, into the ground between the brothers and the figure. Ash spilled from his other hand, scattering across the lawn. He lit the final shard of lantern glass and held it over the iron. Flame burst briefly, illuminating the scene. For a moment, everything stilled, fog freezing mid-swirl, the train flickering like static, the figure recoiling slightly. James whispered the phrase, again the one from decades earlier. Stronger this time. Marcus focused on the words, not the train. Elijah pressed his hands over his ears and looked down. The figure trembled. The rail line rumbled once, violently. The spectral train began to distort, its image tearing at the edges like worn film. Marcus grabbed Elijah's wrist. "Don't look," he repeated. Elijah nodded. The flame flared brighter, then split, shooting upward like a spark. The fog recoiled. The figure staggered backward, dissolving into mist. The train jerked forward, then backward, as if pulled between two worlds. A rush of wind passed through them, carrying faint echoes of voices lost long ago. Then, with a sudden snap, like steel under pressure finally breaking, the image vanished. Silence fell. Heavy. Absolute. The rail line lay dark again. The fog settled. The humming stopped.